Meccano, part number 122. It's a sack. Hi. If you want even more Meccano goodness, why don't you check out my Patreon channel? And please like and subscribe and leave a comment below. I post updates in the community section, not only for this week's Patreon build, but also for what I'm currently working on. Thank you, and back to the build. Hi and welcome back. This week's build is the Dornier Do-X from the 1930s. A bit more on that later. Being born in the 1970s, I think how much I've seen the world change. I caught the end of the golden age of freedom, and have watched the slow spread of the social network era, with the good and the bad that's involved with it. And nostalgia, brought on by age, always does give a different perspective to life. Was my youth any different to that of my daughter? Well, yes and no. Technology has its good and bad points. This channel would never have been created in my childhood, not just because YouTube didn't exist, but every aspect of its creation would not have been possible using the technology I have to hand now, even the ability to research the history of the builds. I remember the long hot summers, the winters that always snowed, the perfect springs and autumns. I also remember that life was hard. We didn't have a lot of money, and the recession-fueled 1970s led to a lot of tension in the household. I think of it as a time of freedom, as I've been told when the evening meal was on the table, and if I wasn't in, then I would get the meal cold later. I played in the woods and fields around where I lived. You could wait minutes before a car drove along the street. The local police officer knew your family by name, and a telling off by your dad was something to be feared. What was said behind your back was not then broadcast to the whole world. Your mistakes stayed as private as you wanted them to be. If you wanted to know something, you visited the library and read a book. I can also remember the boredom of summer holidays, the fear of the Cold War becoming a hot war. I can remember playing with toy guns in the oak wood that attaches to the garden with my friends. The joy of a new Airfix model kit and the sheer pleasure of opening a new tin of Humbrol paint. But how that compares to my mother's life is vastly different, and how that compares to her parents is again another gigantic step in technology. In many ways my life has stagnated with technology, as we don't see the leaps due to them being hidden inside something. Air flight now seems so commonplace. To cross not just the Atlantic, but anywhere in the world is nothing groundbreaking at all. But less than 100 years ago, it was a cutting edge of technology, the great scientific frontier that was being pushed back. For a brief time in the late 1920s and early 1930s, German airships crossed the vast body of water that is the Atlantic Ocean. The design work carried out by Count von Zeppelin, with his airships named after him, must have been an awe-inspiring sight, as well as fear-inducing after the bombing campaign of the First World War. Count von Zeppelin had a young engineer in 1910. Quickly recognising the abilities in the young man, he promoted him within the company. The engineer was Claudius Dornier, who would later establish Dornier GmbH Aircraft Company. His work with Count von Zeppelin was scientific work on strengthening lightweight metals, the challenge that even now the industry still face, that ever elusive goal of reducing weight. The goal was to cross the Atlantic, and at a greater speed than the 80 miles per hour that the airship could attain. The aspiration that the visionaries like Dornier and Jacques Schneider had was that of large flying boats taking off from seaports and carrying passengers in first-class luxury to the end destination. Understanding that to just cross the Atlantic had been reduced from weeks to 5 days by the ocean liner RMS Queen Mary, but a Zeppelin could do it in 43 hours. The dream was to halve that again. And heavier than air flight seemed to give the dream a foothold in reality. Could the science fiction of the 1920s be the science reality of the 1930s? Like all new technologies, engineering is always one step behind the fantasy that gets us into trouble. The theory was fine. Take off from Europe or Britain and either fly north and cross using the UK, Iceland, Newfoundland gap, or head south and cross from West Africa heading for Brazil. The latter of the two was by far the better option, as the outbound flight to America would have favourable trade winds to help carry them, and the distance was the shortest possible. The Dornier Do-X was the largest, heaviest and most powerful flying boat in the world at the time. Planning started in 1925, and it wasn't until 1929 that the aircraft took to the air. Due to the Treaty of Versailles of 1919, in the aftermath of the First World War, the Dornier Do-X had to be built on the Swiss side of Lake Constance. The treaty forbade Germany building aircraft exceeding set speeds and range limits. The aircraft made use of one of the earliest types of age-hardenable aluminium called duralumin. To reduce weights, the wings were a framework of the steel and the aforementioned duralumin, and linen fabric painted in aluminium paint. The aircraft was a semi-cantilever high-wing monoplane powered by 12 Bristol Jupiter radial engines built by Siemens. The engine configuration was a push-pull mounting, and the engine nacelles were joined by an auxiliary wing to help with the stabilisation and mountings. The controls of the aircraft engines were under the watchful eye of the chief engineer, and it was he who would allow the pilot to increase power to the engines if it was requested or needed. But the very real risk of the Bristol Jupiter engines overheating as they tried to meet the power demands of the Dornier Do-X. The level of comfort that the Dornier Do-X presented for its 65 passengers, being attended by a crew of 14, is far beyond anything that we see today in modern aircraft. On its 70th test flight on the 21st of October 1929, the X-1 took 169 people, including 9 stowaways, for a flight of 40 minutes, setting a record that would stand for 20 years for the greatest number of passengers aboard an aircraft. The Flugschiff, or flying ship, was to be used in a way that we would consider financially impractical today. Its first major transatlantic test flight started on the 3rd of November 1930, and it would be another 18 months before the aircraft would return to Germany. The first flight started on the shores of Lake Constance. The route took the X-1 to the Netherlands, and then out to the UK. From there it flew down to France, Spain, and out to Portugal, landing at Lisbon on the 29th of November. While berthed at Lisbon, a tarpaulin caught fire after making contact with a hot exhaust and consumed most of the port wing. It took 6 weeks to repair the damage. From Portugal, the flight path took the X-1 out over the west coast of Africa and on to Cape Verde, landing on the 5th of June 1931, and then to Brazil. Turning north over Puerto Rico, it finally berthed at the Glenn Curtis Airport in New York on the 27th of August. For the next 9 months, the engines needed to be overhauled, till finally the X-1 returned to Berlin on the 24th of May 1932 to around 250,000 people cheering the return. 2 more aircraft were built and entered service with the Italian state airline Sana. But both aircraft were requisitioned by the Italian Air Force. The depression of the 1930s had a lot to do with the failure of the Dornier Do-X. The aircraft was just too large to operate as a commercial success as an airliner. But for a while, it seemed it would succeed as a flying liner. 1932 was a great success, with a tour of the German coastal cities. And in 1933, the planned flight was to see the X-1 head out to Vienna, and then on to Budapest, and finally to Istanbul. Instead of weeks aboard a ship, you could fly in comfort, even sleep aboard for an overnight flight, and tour the world. For the rich, it must have been wonderful. Unfortunately, after a bad landing on a lake near Passau, the tail section was sheared off the aircraft. Sadly, the fate of all 3 airframes was that of destruction. The X-1 was housed in a museum dedicated to flight in Berlin and was sadly destroyed by bombing by the RAF in November of 1943. X-2 and X-3 were cut up for scrap in 1937. And in the end, within 15 years, technology had caught up and surpassed the aircraft. Transatlantic flight would become nothing but normal. Science fiction had become science fact. Had become so what? And the romance was lost to new frontiers. So this model looks nothing like the prototype is meant to. It is a big model. After all, the prototype was 56 tons, with a wingspan of nearly 50 metres. But it is what it represents that is magical. This was truly an age of romance. The idea of cruising aboard the Dornier Do-X must have been dreamlike. It took 26 days to get from Lake Constance to Lisbon. That's no quick flight. The slow, tour-like pace must have been wonderful. From all accounts, the service aboard was perfect. The model itself is one of many that I was not going to build. There is, after all, no engineering in it whatsoever. But there's engineering behind it. This was groundbreaking at the edge of the envelope engineering. Crossing the Atlantic is no simple feat. The planning and faith in the system must have been inspiring. Once you left Cape Verde, you have nothing until you reach Brazil, apart from faith in the engineering and manufacturing of the aircraft. And this flight was low and slow. Maximum altitude was around 10,000 feet, and top speed was around 150 miles per hour before you cooked the engines. With a range of only 1,000 miles, you had to be correct in what you were doing. A sudden headwind, and you were losing speed, burning fuel, and getting nowhere but wet. But it was a fun build, as many of these models are, frequently to my great surprise. Maybe it helped to catch the imagination of some young mind to go on and do great things. For my mother, it helped her to remember a time when the thought of crossing the Atlantic by aircraft was a flight of fantasy.